Test, test. Good. Hi, everyone. This is Achyuta Bhava from Nightlight Astrology. And today I thought I would go live. I'd do a live cast to talk about the re-entrance of Saturn into Capricorn, as well as Jupiter's approaching Pluto in Capricorn. I want to talk about all of these collectively and just sort of do a reset on the Saturn-Pluto experience, because it's been a while since we've talked about it. I know at least it's been a while since I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about a lot of things going on, like Venus retrograde, the eclipses, and so on and so forth. But I haven't taken a lot of time to think about just kind of recalibrating my relationship to the unfolding of the Saturn-Pluto dynamic, which is very much still in the air. And by the beginning of July, in the next couple of weeks, is about to start reasserting itself as Jupiter also conjoins with Pluto. That's a whole lot of Saturn, and it also reflects the Saturn-Pluto dynamic in a way that I think is worth, it's going to be strong again, so we should revisit it. And just, we've been through a lot since, January, February, when that wave of Saturn-Pluto passed through. So at any rate, I hope that this will be useful for everybody. Someone's saying that I just came on mid-sentence. Yeah, I was testing it, and it seemed like it was live, but I think I'm live now. So anyway, good to see all of you. So I want to focus on one particular dimension of the Saturn-Pluto experience that there's many, but I feel like this is one that's worth talking about right now. At least it's been important to me in my own kind of reflections on the dynamic. I was reminded of this because I revisited some of the section on Saturn-Pluto, the Saturn-Pluto archetypal combination in Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche. Let's see if I have it. So here's the book. It's well-loved, well-read book on my shelf, Cosmos and Psyche. I couldn't recommend it, more highly for people who are interested in learning more about astrology, especially the outer planetary cycles and their relationship to the unfolding of events in the collective over the past, couple of 100 years at least. Anyway, I was rereading about that, and one of the interesting things that Richard Tarnas did, along with his sort of mentor, Stanislav Grof, was to map out the archetypal combinations of the planets in relation to the step-by-step experience of birth, so the birthing process. And then as I was remembering how Saturn and Pluto can kind of find their place in the process of birth, and this was birth that was being talked about in relation to the psychedelic experience of LSD therapy or through holotropic breath work, but also in the literal delivery of a child into the world. And I was reminded of being present for both of the birth of both of my children and being there with my wife as she labored and gave birth. So and I just thought, this is so relevant right now. So I thought this is what we'll talk about today. So Saturn and Pluto pertain to that, their combination, which even if we're just looking at the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction at the end of this month, is activated because we've got Jupiter and Pluto in Saturn's sign. Like everyone's hanging out in Saturn's house right now with those three planets, right? So Saturn has a lot of say. Well, Pluto is that force that it represents the subterranean forces and pressures that mount and build over time, and then eventually they explode, like a volcano, or like for example, in birth, when there's the kind of expulsion of the baby, and the baby comes out, and with it comes blood and mucus and feces and the placenta, and it's raw and it's primal, but that's birth comes with that, right? It's like a package, you get it all together. So, but that force, that huge releasing force that's in nature, that's in birth, that's in so many different things, that's Plutonian. That's one of the ways we think about Pluto. And that force sometimes erupts in the collective as well. For example, if you look back at the Uranus-Pluto dynamics of the 1960s, or recently with the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, if you look at what's happening right now in the collective, there are these major releases of pent up energy that usually have very deep history. And, the plates move, and then boom, there's this huge, shaking or expulsion of pent up energy. And of course, that Plutonian energy, when it releases, it can be very revelatory. You can see things that you haven't been able to see, hidden forces in the unconscious or the personal psyche or the collective psyche, things that have been they seem to have been lying dormant, or maybe you think, well, they're no longer a problem, or this isn't an issue, and then boom, they appear, and they come up as though they've been there all along. So that cathartic release of pent up energy can have history behind it in the personal or collective psyche, and so forth. Now that force, that Plutonian force, now what you have to imagine is that we're now blending or combining it with Saturn. And Saturn is going to be, the force of containment, restraint, confinement. And so when you put that into the context of the birthing experience, Groff and Tarnas compared it to the contractive forces of labor and the primal screaming of labor, which sometimes come out in certain forms of trauma release therapy or LSD therapy or holotropic breath work. And the ayahuasca experiences that I had for about 10 years of my life also, it was very common to see people go through these feelings of being really stuck in some place and then just screaming or purging or barfing or going out the bottom. So that's very Plutonian mixed with Saturn, because you also have to have this constraining or confining force. And one of the things that happens, for women who have given birth, I'm not trying to speak for the experience, just what I saw being there for 2 births and then passing a kidney stone, which like it doesn't end, as I've been joking around, like it doesn't end in having like a warm soul to hold, you just get a rock. But some of the women in my life who have had kidney stones and who have given birth to me that the pain is comparable to contractions in labor. It was the most painful experience I've ever had. But in those contractive spaces, right, it's as though you're being squeezed, restricted, and yet that those forces go along with, in some ways they precede, or they are co-present with this expulsion of energy that comes. So there's contraction and expulsion at the same time. Now, stars are born, like that. Thunder, clouds gather, they build tension, they split apart, thunder, lightning, the deluge that comes. But that's that particular part where you're being squeezed and restricted, but then release is going to come. That when Saturn and Pluto are with each other, that doesn't happen all at once. Just like a labor takes, sometimes a couple of days. I mean, my wife's first labor was 40 hours. Crazy, right? 40. I felt like I just thought it was never going to end at certain points. But at any rate, it lasts a long time. And the contractions come in waves, and progress and big pushes and big releases come, and then it retracts again, right? So that's a Saturn-Pluto dynamic where there's the force of history is trying to create change in some ways, and explosive sometimes. And then other times it's going to happen in and through these contractive spaces that we get into. So that's a little bit about the Saturn-Pluto dynamic. But I wanted to take that, and now I want to kind of focus in on why this is so important, what this provides us with as spirit souls who are each evolving, trying to grow spiritually, and some of the pitfalls that we can get into and miss the opportunity of the moment, right? Miss the opportunity of the contractive space, because the case tends to be, because we're all, in my opinion, like a little, like we can get a little manic about these things. And I mean that in the back. We just get a little like, like I want the big transformative, totally cathartic change, and I want it now, right? So in a sense, it's like Pluto's a little bit like a transformative crack or cocaine or something like that. We all can get kind of hooked on it. But we don't necessarily love the Saturn bit, because Saturn is the part where, it feels great to go through some kind of educational program, but I hate to write the dissertation, or I hate to have to, edit the book that I write. I just want to put it out there. So that part that forces us back inward, that makes us bide our time, that's unbearably long suffering, that's the Saturn. But so as we're trying to release these energies, why is Saturn so important? What does Saturn provide us with in the midst of that? And that's what I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I have felt like some areas of my life have felt like unbearably slow in changing in the ways that I kind of hope that they will, or whatever. So a few things. Let's talk about this. Let's just speak through Saturn, Pluto for a moment. There's lots of, every planet offers a different picture of what change and growth looks like, but let's think about it from the Saturn, Pluto perspective. For Saturn, Pluto, there is no quick path to moral virtue, to real character change, or to spiritual enlightenment. It's not something that you can do quickly. It's not, a weekend intensive that suddenly just changes everything forever. Saturn, Pluto reminds us that real change is often unbearably, tediously, embarrassingly slow and humbling and humiliating. And that we have to stick with a process over a really long period of time and be willing to be just kind of grind up in that process. It can feel like that anyway. And that Saturn Pluto says, look, the real change is also going to come through this long labor. And then there can be moments where the change is really radical and quick, but it'll keep pulling back and pulling back. So where do we see that the tediousness of growth in our lives? Well, one way of seeing them is to recognize that, for example, one of my, there's an astrologer that Chris Brennan in the Astrology Podcast recently published named Alan White. And he had this interesting take on Pluto that really stuck with me, which was that Pluto makes big things small and small things big. Think, for example, of nuclear energy. It's really tiny, it can make a big bomb. Oftentimes what we struggle with is saying, okay, like I'm going to use an example from my own life as a parent. Like, I want to be the patient parent. You know what I mean? So I hold up this image of myself as like, okay, there's the patient parent, and I'm, that's what I've got to get myself to. But Pluto, in a sense, wants to detonate that image. It just wants to say, too big, too arrogant, hubris, pride, too, like that. And instead, it wants to strip it back to the minute, the everyday stuff. So, for example, it becomes an impossible task to try to become the patient person. Like, what is that? It's an image that's really hard to live up to because we don't live in the kind of in an ideal state. We live in a moment by moment reality. And we grow into our character developments, little thing by little thing, little issue by little issue. So those big ideals that we set out for ourselves, they can be oftentimes just completely detonated with Pluto transits. And then we get pulled into the mundane reality of the issue. So it's not like, I do want to become a more patient parent, but Saturn Pluto will say, okay, it's great that you're on a high horse about wanting to be this, this patient person, this paragon of virtue or whatever. But, let's get down to the nitty gritty. What is it like to be at the dinner table every night? Like, for me, like, one of the most frustrating things is like my 2-year-old, she can't, it takes her like 4 hours to eat like anything. So it's like, it always, for my wife and I, both of us, it just feels like we're in this like, oh my God, it's the most tedious, painstaking thing. And it really, really challenges our sense of sanity and like patience. So, and I know that like probably a lot of you can relate. There's some area like this. But the point is that Saturn and Pluto want to restrict us to the immediate thing that, let's say, you just suck at, that you really struggle with. And it is not something that you can go, and I've heard this quote recently, virtue signaling, and the way that people can do that. And I think in all different walks of life, we do this. Like you can't go and virtue signal about that. It's not something you can go and have a big confessional, post a meme, make sure you got lots of thumbs up so that everybody in the collective sphere of your life knows that you're like a good person who supports the right things, believes and says the right things, are on with the right collective bandwagon of whatever is virtuous at the moment, that's important at the moment. You can't do that with most of the stuff that you're confined and restrained to deal with in your everyday life. For example, when you're sitting, this is something that James Hillman wrote a lot about, and so that's where I got this idea from. It's not original to me, but you sit at the table and you realize that those thoughts that you have when your daughter won't frigging eat the food, and the way that you're dealing with the nitty gritty of your own humanity, your own limitations, your own shortcomings, your own impatience, where you are an embarrassingly small human being, with small thoughts about a 2-year-old child. You know what I mean? Like, but we have to be willing to just burn, to be transfigured in the mundane, small, humble details of our struggles. And Saturn and Pluto will not let you get out of here until you've done that. Right? And how can we see that reflected in the collective right now? I saw a headline for The Onion, and the headline of The Onion said, phase 4 in pretending like we've started phase 4 in pretending like the coronavirus is gone. I just thought it was perfect. It perfectly captured, something that I think is very human, which is that it's like, it's so much easier for me to just like confess or announce or proclaim or go out into the world somewhere and try to signal to everyone that like I'm a good person here. I'm really like I'm really better than the worst in me, and here are the different ways in which I can have that validated, or I can show that to the world or whatever. But if we dare to be deeply present for every moment of every day in our lives, what we are faced with is the humbling, the humbling silence of our own inadequacies. It's too embarrassing, it's too shameful to go online and to say something about. It's I'm a YouTube personality, I'm an astrologer, I'm a yogi, I've got a Hindu name, blah blah blah, right? These kind of things, I can get caught up with them myself, and then what? And then I have to go down and be, a husband or a father or a cousin or a brother or whatever. And I've got to go be a person. And it's really, really difficult, So Pluto Saturn is Pluto is so gigantic. It's titanic. And the feeling of needing to release and transform and become the patient person or become the ideal, shed the layers, burn off the bad stuff, become the ideal image. And it's not that we're not heading towards something ideal. It's that we'll never get there if we aren't comfortable to be just so deeply present for the most embarrassingly confining elements of our own character. And that's why prayer or meditation is so necessary to deal with these forces constructively. Someone asked me recently if I could give a definition of spiritual bypassing. And I don't think spiritual bypassing is what people think it is. People often think, I get it. There's a version of spiritual bypassing that goes like this. You are, trying to avoid the gritty stuff in life and you're just going to like meditate and pray and pretend like it's not there. Fine, I get it. But what's ironic is that most people who issue that criticism don't pray daily. They don't meditate daily. They aren't deeply committed to a spiritual process. And so they really have no room to talk. That's my own kind of comeback to that. Here's my definition of spiritual bypassing as I've understood it from the position of having like a really a committed daily sadhana for a long time. When we avoid doing the hard work to improve ourselves as human beings, to midwife the awakening of the spirit soul that is slow, gradual, private, painful, humiliating, not anything we can brag about, not things that we go and look for social validation in, that if we aren't doing that, that is spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is what is meant by that, in my opinion, is when we bypass the very, very difficult, mundane, boring details of our shortcomings that we're working on. When we look over that or try to jump over that, which oftentimes we are doing as soon as we accuse anyone else of spiritual bypassing, then that's when, in my opinion, that's when we're actually spiritual bypassing. Because what spiritual bypassing should really mean is that we are bypassing the need to be spiritual, to practice spiritual life. So, and of course, I agree that that could also include people who want to avoid the difficulties or darknesses of the world through just meditating or prayer. But I think that a more prominent and more everyday version of spiritual bypassing is people who don't want to be confined to the most, just the most degradingly simple elements of our shortcomings. It's not something you can get a lot of thumbs up about on Facebook for. And that's, for me, like, that's the message that I most need to hear most days. In my experience, when real work that we have to do on ourselves is, in many ways, the reason that we can gain so much from being confined to this more mundane sphere of our own shortcomings. You can look back to the birth analogy. Okay, so, I remember, again, with my wife, and then, to a certain extent, passing a kidney stone, my own little experience of birth. But with my wife especially, there was this realization with the midwives. We were working with some midwives and our doula, and they would say, these contractions, you want to move with them, and then that the pushing is coming in a synchronized dance with the contractions. And so aligning our will and our effort with the contractions is really important. Just like in birth, I remember the doula saying to my wife, numerous occasions, don't fight it. If you resist, it'll make it worse. And that's very true in ayahuasca ceremonies as well. Like in ayahuasca ceremonies, it was very much like, if I start tightening up when the jaws of the python, the cosmic python, are around me, and if I start tightening up, I'm really screwed. Because then I'm seeing these contractive forces as an oppositional, like an opponent. And really the opportunity of these contractions is to keep returning me back to the present. And what is the reward of living in presence through such experiences? It's that we all become mothers. We all become midwives. We become stewards of creation. And we become intimately acquainted with the pain of contraction. We also learn what it means to become a servant. And that is the greatest gift ever, because it turns out that when you're in a position of service, boy, does it take the pressure off in terms of trying to find this elusive, totally isolated personal version of happiness that's just not anywhere to be found. We start serving life, each other, God, etc. It turns out that that is the source of all true happiness, all true love, and there's no shortage of reciprocation. When we start loving and serving, we find that everything is loving and serving us. It's a change in consciousness. And more than anything, what I saw change in my wife through these experiments, sorry, I'm gonna cry. So I just love her so much. And she changed in such a deep way from becoming a mother. And I've benefited so much from it too, and from becoming a parent. But anyway, one of the ways in which she changed tremendously was she was a yoga studio owner. We both were. And as she became a better yoga teacher, she became better with her staff. She became, but eventually she also realized that that splitting her time for her between an exhaustive amount of work managing a yoga studio and tending to her own spiritual life and to her children, she kind of had a crisis of identity, and we ended up closing the yoga studio last year. She's happier than I've ever seen her, and it's just been one process after another of watching her move with contractions, limitations, and things that come in and constrain and feel like they're trying to negate you. But I've heard her many times say, everything that I learned in birth, it feels like I'm still using. And and that's an initiation, of course, that we could say is archetypal. It can apply to any human in all places, not just limited to mothers. But midwifing those moments of contractive crisis in our lives, and navigating them with integrity and refusing to try to barrel through them, which eventually just breaks us down and makes us so stressed out. Hypertension is such a problem because of this. And so anyway, I've just seen her grow so much as a person because of that. And that's the Saturn-Pluto dynamic, watching her learn to move with the contractions, not saying, oh, I got to fight this force that's trying to squeeze and negate me or whatever. It's trying to limit me or define or confine me, but instead says, I'm going to move with this. I'm going to learn to serve this process. So anyways, that's the gift of Saturn Pluto, is that, in some ways, like we could see another wave through COVID-19 of being, pushed back into our homes, or, forced to social distance again or something like that. And those contractions are deeply meaningful. Those contractions are inviting us to participate in the midwifing of a different form of consciousness. I know that sounds really grand and idealistic, and people hear that and they're like, yeah, that's all good, but like, I just don't see, is that practical? But it is, because look at what happened with the first wave of contraction. You put everyone in a pressure cooker like that, constrain, deep contraction. Look at what just ripped forth, look at what just came right out into the world. And maybe there was, I guess that's kind of an interesting slip of the tongue. You think about sometimes when women are birthing, they'll tear. Well, sometimes it's destructive and it's a little violent, but it's also, that's how life comes out sometimes too. And that's what's happened in the world. I mean, there's been a huge surge of transformative energy that came forth, not just the pandemic and what that's doing to maybe change us very gradually over a long period of time, but the kind of alchemical condition that it created so that the forces of the collective could also pour through in a number of different ways to change elements of an unjust or corrupt system. So, and again, I don't mean to idealize it, because these changes are, there will be contractions, and I'm kind of like, mark my words, like the prophet says, like there will be contractions where it feels really regressive still, which means that, and this is the way that it was when I was birthing my kidney stone. I would be like, oh my God, I think it passed. I think it cleared. I think I got through it. And then, 4 hours later, I'd be like doubled back over in pain, just like, curled up in the fetal position again, because, those little tubes are squeezing the rock out of your body. You know what I mean? So there will be feelings that will come through the rest of this year, where there's a real contraction that comes again. And we are on the brink of another one, which is why I'm giving this talk. The more contractive force will come through probably in the next month, as Jupiter gets back into the conjunction with Pluto, but welcomes Saturn also back into its own sign, where Saturn is like, all right, you rowdy house guests that want to create change, I'm going to lock it all down, So, yeah. Now I'll say a few more things, then I'm going to end, open up for questions if you've got them. Let's see. What is the another benefit of all of this is that how does spiritual change happen by having to deal with and stick to the mundane, embarrassing details of our character development or of our spiritual awakening, the stuff we can't tell a lot of people about. Most people can't afford a therapist to sit and talk with about it. If you had one, maybe you could, but a lot of the real deep work of inner life is so painfully private. But what's so beautiful about that painfulness of that privacy is that is also where the infinite uniqueness of the spirit soul is found, awakened, recognized, and it's done so in communion with the super soul that lives in our heart, with Paramatma, as we say, or with God. It's like when we're forced to that inner place of frustration and failure and suffering within, it's in that place, sticking with it, being with it, that we find forgiveness, self-respect, love, enlightenment, awakening, and we're working out our existence in that space. And the voice that encourages us, that helps us along, that sticks with us in that space is our source, right? So we discover our soul and we discover its ever encouraging, well-wishing spiritual source. And there is no relationship in the universe that is not infinitely unique when it comes to the soul and its relationship to source. So the pain and the limitation and the confinement and the embarrassing smallness of our petty details of our life, that is also the very ground in which we can discover microscopic moments of forgiveness, grace, compassion, encouragement, victory. And we need that because the kingdom of heaven is in a mustard seed. It's so small, it's so tiny. We don't cultivate it there. We can't see it we can't start to see the nuance of God and in an ensouled world. So it takes that kind of confinement to be able to see it in the places that most need grace, forgiveness, humility, care, compassion. So that's one of the reasons why we have to stick with the smallness and the quietness. There's a verse that, I think it was, I can't remember which book now, but Jesus is saying, don't be like the hypocrites who pray out in the streets. And that, surely they'll have their just reward, but pray in the secret. Why is that an instruction? Well, I'm not at all saying that this has nothing, again, not speaking now to the need for social action or anything like that, but what is it about trying to be a spiritual performance artist in the world that doesn't work? It doesn't work because the ones that grant us validation on that level are also very quick to cast us down if we make a mistake. It's truth. It's just the truth of the way we work in the collective. That we can do. There's a lot of good in the collective, but one of the dangers that we have in trying to receive our spiritual validation in a vast ocean of the public arena is that the things that are honored there and put up on a pedestal are also very quick and often cast down just as quickly. So that's something we have to be very careful of. Forgiveness is the cornerstone of the individuating or awakening soul because the degree to which we are willing to forgive and inclined to appreciate, to give all appreciation to others first, rather than judge, is the degree to which we've stuck with our own flaws in the small cracks of our lives and found grace, patience, and tolerance within. And it's that vision that we receive of being able to love ourselves through all of the madness, that we have to encounter if we stay awake and pay attention, that allows us to see it in everything and everyone. And it's paradoxical and it's complicated, but beauty would have nothing less than paradox and complication. So most of the time we don't get to the paradox and complication that accompanies beauty unless we also have a practice of listening, listening first, and that not listening to others first and not listening to the world first. That is part of it, but listening within first. So, for example, the little micro moments that we can. And by the way, chanting or meditation practice, or even a prayerful practice, a mindful practice, a journaling practice daily is so important to developing this. But like a micro moment, let's say that there's a voice in your head that just sees something on TV or social media, and you just go that, you just have a moment where you just go off on the person in your head, right? A lot of the times when that voice comes in, we'll jump in with another voice, immediately excusing, justifying that behavior intellectually. We do that because we have not yet established the ability to just listen to that voice. Oh, you must be really hurting. You must be really mad. You probably have some good reasons for that. Let me feel about those. Let me feel into those reasons. Oh, yes, I can feel those. By that time, we've de-escalated that voice within us. And so the response to that voice doesn't have to be, as quick, reactive, and its justification is not needed anymore. We have disarmed ourselves, and so then we start to find compassion, and that voice. You see, we've not canceled that voice inside of ourselves because we've understood its presence. We've understood it within us. So we're not going to say, I'm just going to cancel that voice or justify it. We're not looking to either justify or be justified, cancel or be canceled. Those extremes never take us to soul. But when we, you stick with it and you just listen. And then suddenly this flowering, multidimensional, multivalent complexity, sophistication, paradox, and beauty starts to emerge. You can see it's like suddenly that voice becomes part of a multifaceted jewel of experience. And that's what we're looking for. Like, that's what we want. We just, especially in the collective, we're going at a breakneck speed toward a future that doesn't exist. You know what I mean? In the way that we think it does. And so, it's really hard to be patient and to listen, to just really deeply listen to what's happening or what people are saying, whether we agree or disagree. It's really hard. And of course, as soon as you suggest listening or showing appreciation to others as developing that inclination to do so, people naturally will become very defensive. Well, that means that I'm justifying someone else's behavior, or that I'm validating something that's inappropriate or negative or even evil. And that's not what we're saying at all. We're saying that for something to be more than good or bad, for something to be more, which is not to say that it has no element of good or bad in it. It's just for it to be more than just good or bad. Just good or bad. We have to take time to listen, to really listen, to sit with something for a long time. And that's what Saturn does. Saturn says, you are not getting out of here until you really, really sit with things. And so that is a regressive feeling at times when Pluto is also wanting to just get the baby out. Let's get a nice volcano of just blood and life. Let's reset. So very interesting forces to have combining with one another, but they're in a conjunction right now, which, as Richard Tarnas said, means if we stick with this process, the structures that we build in our lives, the real reform that we make, will last a very long time. So stick with it for a long time. The changes are substantive over a long period of time. Okay. So that is what I wanted to share with you guys today about Saturn Pluto. I hope that this was helpful. And one of the things that I think we have to be very, here's one of the things that I think, this is just a personal opinion, but the role of a comedian in society is in some ways to be emblematic of that self-effacing simple stupidness of our human struggle. The role of comedians is to do that in some way. And I think we're in trouble if we forget how to laugh. If we forget how to laugh at ourselves, and if we forget how to find salvational humor in our darkness. And I get worried when I see especially, and I'm not saying that there's been some comedians I know that have done some bad things that have been called out over the past few years, but more and more I get worried when I notice that there is the inability to bring people together through a very nuanced and funny exploration of our darkness. And so I think one of the signs that I'll take as a good thing, I'll take it as a good sign, a good omen, when I feel like more people are laughing and being able to, find the embarrassing but laughable moments of life again together. Sometimes I feel lately like it's a little bit lost, but maybe that's just me. Anyway, so I thank you all for being here today. I hope that this was interesting and served some good points. The text you referred to is in the book of Matthew, chapter 6, 5-6. Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm coming back with a talk in the next couple of days on Mercury turning retrograde in Cancer. So that'll be coming up. And then there's some other Q&A videos I'm doing and stuff like that. If you follow my Bhakti channel, there'll be a new video this week on 9 gurus from nature. That is a talk that's coming up. You can sign up for free on my website, nightlightastrology.com. Some people are still signing up for my course. We did reach our capacity with with some of our scholarships, not all of them, but some of them. And but you can still over between now and the end of the month, we're still going to let people in if they want to. We'll probably be capping it again in the fall, so there will probably be a limit on the class in the fall. I think we're not sure yet. Just depends on where things are at with COVID and whatever. But anyway, if you still want to check that out, you can on my website, nightlightastrology.com. So I hope you guys are having a painfully slow, embarrassing, detail-oriented, sucky week. No, I'm just kidding. I hope you're suffering well and that you're finding humor. And lots of love to everyone. Take it easy. Bye.